The first presenters, Daisy, Venusi, and Io from Unitec Institute of Technology, have been invited to open up in a way this morning's session because they provide us with an overall overview, I would say, of the effects of migration on migrants and diaspora communities in New Zealand and on the Pacific Island community of Samoa, Niue and Tonga. So I'd like to invite all of you, Daisy and Venusi and Io, to share your presentation today.
Thank you, Velia.
Tanga loa he mapualang, tanga loa he halafualang, tū mai, tākina mai uta, tākina mai lalo, hake mai toke lau, hake mai tonga. Ke ta mai e taumanuina, ke whala atu, ke he hamautoro, a whakamatalanga he māma he ahoni.
Talafulava. My name is Daisy. I'm one of Pacific Learning Advisors at Unitec, and it's a privilege to be part of the symposium this year and for us to be here to share our stories of migration.
I am Ioane Aleke whawai. Happy to be part of this presentation today.
Malolale, my name is Venusi Taumoepeau. I'm a learning advisor at Unitec and looking forward to sharing our narratives.
Just a brief outline of our presentation today. We will look at migration in terms of the definition, as well as relating it to Pacific diaspora in New Zealand, and then the impact of migration on diaspora in New Zealand, as well as mirror economies in the Pacific, and then of course sharing our narratives of migration. So migration is broadly defined by the United Nations organization as any person who is moving or has moved across an international border for various reasons. In the case of Pacific peoples here in New Zealand, we've got three broad descriptions that describe who we are. As migrants, a person moving from his or her Pacific place of origin to be in New Zealand for various reasons and with the intention of living in New Zealand permanently. Sometimes after living in New Zealand for a long time, some Pacific migrants decide to return to their home countries. There's also the second generation concept, which refers to children of migrants who were born in the place of origin, or as well as those born in New Zealand. And then we've got a description of New Zealand-born Pacific peoples, and these specifically concept describes all the children of migrant parents who are born in New Zealand, have lived in New Zealand, spent most of their lives in New Zealand.
Land of milk and honey, a term synonymous in our communities, a term used for the main migration of Pacific people in New Zealand, which is the 1950s and 60s. New Zealand was going through an economic boom, so they opened up their borders and allowed migration from Pacific Islands to come and work in the factories, nursing, low-income jobs, basically for a better life. The term is like utopian in its context, that Pacific people were moving to a place where they could improve education, wealth for their family, and betterment for their future. The term's still relevant to recent Pacific migrants, and the same with similar context, better employment opportunities, health, maybe political reasons, and climate change reasons of why there's recent migration of Pacific people.
Now, there are at least three types of categories for migration to New Zealand, which are the temporary visa or visas, and also those who are residents and the Round Nations, which includes Tokelau, the Cook Islands, and Niue. Because of their political relationship with New Zealand, they have free association with New Zealand, so they can travel backwards and forwards from their home countries.
Muted.
Oh, Eel, you're muted. Eel, you're muted.
Pacific diaspora in New Zealand. As McGovern have quoted, it's defined as the very nature of a diaspora relies on peoples contained within to identify a distant homeland. And it also includes chain migration and the role of churches that were established during their time when they migrated here in New Zealand, and so on and so forth.
If we look at this diaspora community of Pacific people in New Zealand, the narrative is still the same. They still reflect the same diversity. You can see that in the population growth. In 1945, Pacific population was only 0.1% of New Zealand, which is about 2,000 people. And then after the migration, that population changed to about 65,000. That was about 2% of the New Zealand population in 1976 after that migration influx. And now when we look at New Zealand, we almost make up about 8% of New Zealand's population at around 380,000, and we're looking to reach around 600,000 in 2040. Of that population, 60% live in New Zealand, live in Auckland, 60%, and of that population, a lot of that population has changed. When the first migration came, a lot of that population were island-born migrants, but now when we look at today's makeup, New Zealand-born Pacific people make up about 60% of that total population, with recent Pacific migrants still traveling to New Zealand.
So with the Pacific Islands, where Pacific migrants came from, predominantly they were considered to be Arab economies, and so for these countries, they were heavily reliant on migration and remittances, foreign aid, and their states were characteristically bureaucratic in nature.
And there are many impacts on Pacific countries due to migration. For example, a loss of connection to families. When you've been away for a very long period of time, you get disconnected. One of the examples there is the brain drain since the 1990s. Looking at New Zealand aid and Australia aid, which they provide to a lot of Pacific Islanders or Pacific Islands, which helps with scholarships. So a lot of them would study abroad here in New Zealand and Australia, acquired all the skills, and they end up remaining in New Zealand or Australia, which does not help or has a negative impact on our Pacific Islands, and also depopulation in the realm nations of Tokelau, Cook Islands, and Niue. And looking also at the impact of diaspora communities. A few examples there, but one of the examples I wanted to highlight here is the loss of traditions. For example, the language. A lot of New Zealand born now are not able to speak their Indigenous language, which also impacts on their identity. One of the other examples that our Pacific communities or peoples here in New Zealand have negative impact on their health, and there's a high mortality rate in contrast to other groups. Besides that, there are also positives, the impact on diaspora communities. Having the sense of nationalism within New Zealand, not felt in home countries. And these are often demonstrated in sports or different types of sports. And also this year, formal apology Dawn reigns. As we can see there, there is a commitment of our Aotearoa New Zealand communities towards our Pacific peoples.
Okay. My experience of migration is quite colourful in the sense that earlier in 1987, I came to New Zealand for the very first time as I suppose a tourist for 2 weeks, and so it is this trip to New Zealand that continues to influence how I look at New Zealand. But it was a memorable time coming to New Zealand. Also, you know, my experience of the New Zealand lifestyle was really through visiting families who came to Samoa for holidays, and that they would bring with them what we call in Samoa also meaning, you know, treats or goodies that visiting families would bring with them. And so when they come, not just suitcases, but they'll have boxes of goodies for the family who are waiting for them back home. And one of those treats today, not so much, I don't, you know, think of it a lot in that same sense, but for me, that box, when it's opened, the freshness that comes out, the smell of it, knowing that it's come from New Zealand, is really, really different. It's a sense that I can't relate to others who have not experienced that. But also just having an apple that's been brought from New Zealand, the crisp, the freshness of it really, for me, takes me back to those early periods in my life. In 1989, my parents brought us to New Zealand for education reasons. Yeah, move on, Venusi. And so therefore, in that time in New Zealand, it was for me very different, frustrating at times, because I was new at a school, didn't speak English fluently, and often, you know, was surprised, but didn't think of it negatively, that, you know, when I was called by other Pacific or New Zealand-born Pacific children at the school, I was called a freshie. But for me, I thought that meant a good thing. It was years later that I realized that no, it wasn't intended to mean a good thing. But that's something that'll stay with me, and it'll be part of my story. So in 1993, my parents took us back to Samoa, where I completed high school, then received a scholarship through Education Aid, which New Zealand contributes to the Pacific, got a scholarship, went to Fiji to do my undergraduate studies. And so I was very blessed to have been a recipient of aid in that way. So as an adult, in 2007, my husband and I came with our 2 children at the time, who were born in Samoa, for me to complete my postgraduate studies. And it was in 2007 that our first New Zealand-born child was born. And so it wasn't then that we decided to migrate to New Zealand. It was a year or a bit later, in 2009, my husband and I finally made that move with our then 3 children. So therefore, I consider myself to be a migrant. I am a parent of 2nd generation as well as New Zealand-born Pacific children. For us as migrants in this country, it means we are removed physically with our community back home, but spiritually, we have never been removed, and that we are part of it. My husband goes back and forth in terms of Falawalawe because he's a chief. Therefore, he's got obligations, traditional obligations, and also we still have family back home. We have our siblings. My parents have retired back home. So this is what my diaspora community looks like in New Zealand. So I've got those, that trip to New Zealand in '87 as a young child, experiencing New Zealand for the first time. But this is what it looks like. I've got my family who are my foundation. part of my culture, part of my being, who will always be with me regardless whether I'm in New Zealand as a migrant, whether I'm in Australia or elsewhere in the world. I'm part of my church community, I'm part of my children's school communities, as well as my work community. Therefore, these communities represent me as a Pacific person, also me as a Samoan person living in New Zealand. Whakatai.
Yeah, as a migrant to New Zealand, I was born in Niue. I attended school at the age of 4, and most of my education was full immersion in the Wangahau Niue. My mother is from Niue, but my dad's from Tonga. He's got Tongan and Samoan ancestry. He also migrated to Niue in the 1970s. In 1988, I and my younger brother and my mother migrated here to New Zealand for temporary reasons, but we ended up staying here for at least 2 years. And I attended school here in Otara Rongamai Primary, which I acquired my English language skills whilst my mother was studying at the Kukiarani Pakari Trust towards design textiles. And on my return back in 1990 to Niue, because I'd been away for at least 2 years, and by then when I returned, there was only one Niue primary school, whereas before I was attending the local village primary school. I didn't really know anyone, even though I had cousins from the village. I think I was a bit confused because I was away for at least 2 years and very foreign when all the primary schools have been combined as one. But over the years, I was able to connect to a lot of my cousins and other friends in the school. Also, my experiences living in diaspora, some are bad, some are good, but it's also been good living in diaspora because you care so much about your culture and your language, and having to maintain it through many different mediums, and being also initiating projects which contributes to the prosperity of tangata Niue living here in New Zealand or diaspora, and also being exposed to different opportunities through education, and also being part in decision making on different boards or forums, and having a very colourful and prosperous career in media before moving on to working in this sector, tertiary sector at the moment.
Thanks for so my experience. We've talked about it in previous slides. I'm a New Zealand-born Pacific Islander, New Zealand-born Tongan, born post Dawn Raids. Dawn Raids was a time in the 70s where the government marginalized Pacific people, accusing them of being overstays, and I was born post that, so there was still, when I was growing up, there was slight stigma around Pacific people. I grew up in a classic suburban Kiwi neighborhood. Me and my brother went to a primary school where we were the only Tongans. My parents, both Tongan speaking, really wanted us to speak English, so they fostered that in the home. As a result, I can't speak Tongan, but we are still connected to our culture through family and cultural events. Really proud of my Tongan heritage. I do get asked if I feel more Tongan or more Kiwi, and I honestly will say I feel more Tongan, because growing up I just related to people, seeing people of the same cultural ethnicity, and what I've noticed as I've grown up is that due to the population change, that there's a lot more Pacific people. You see them on TV, you see them in the workplace, you see a lot of theories or ideologies of different island groups come into the workspace, and it's great to be able to see that change in New Zealand. Yeah, I went to Catholic boys' schools, studied the arts, specialized in film. I still work on film projects that talks to our communities. At the same time, I work at Unitec, and I've spent 4 or 5 years, before that was 4 or 5 years in the corporate space. And so I've been in between these two spaces of being Tongan in a New Zealand born Western environment. I've experienced it in different ways. So it's great to be able to work with my colleagues, Daisy and Io. We all grew up in different islands, Io and Niue, Daisy in Samoa, and me in New Zealand, but yet we make a good team because we all share the same cultural values that's inherent around in the Pacific, mainly around being really close to our big families. So yeah, that's my experience of migration, being a Pacific-born, New Zealand-born Tongan.
Thank you, Venusi. Just to wrap up our presentation. So for something that we want to continue to iterate and advocate for is the fact that Pacific people's population is increasing and will continue to do so for a long time, is that we are not homogenized. This is something that's come about, for many reasons, and many people in different sectors have advocated for this. So, and that we're all different, we're unique in our ways, although we share cultural values that are similar to each other. Also, in the 1950s and 60s, being brown was something that was considered negative. Now, in modern day New Zealand, you find that being brown is also something to be celebrated and be proud of. So therefore, we want to finish by saying that we are diverse, we contribute to New Zealand society in various ways, and that we are here to stay, but also we will never lose touch with our home countries where we're from. Whaftai lava. Whaftai whakawelahi malo.
Thanks, everyone. Aloha pito.
In such kind of fora, we often get involved into theories and models and different interpretations in an abstract way. And listening to you today, going through your personal experiences as migrants, first or second generation, was really important, I felt, to connect with the issues of today. So thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions, any comments from our participants this morning?
Thanks a lot for your presentation. What will be interesting is for your presentation to extend to reverse migration, such as myself. I moved back to Samoa 11 years ago. And it's a very different experience from actually coming here when you actually go back there. Because when I've been away from Samoa for 11 years now, all of my peers, all of my cousins and my relatives, they've all grown up without growing up with me over the last, decade or so. So when I got back, I felt like I had to relearn Samoa and my family and everybody that I went to school with at St. Joseph's College, because they all have kids now, they've grown up and everything. I had to sort of relearn everything about Samoa. And another thing is that people locally kind of felt that I was a threat, that I was actually coming back to take over their jobs because I had higher qualification, more overseas experience, and then all of that. And there have been cases of Samoans doing the reverse migration back to Samoa, working in the government sector, where there'll be a group of Samoans deliberately refuse to speak English to oust the Samoan from New Zealand, the States, or Australia from trying to take over the workforce. So I just wanted to share you that experience as a reverse migrant person. that, you know, those politics, I think it should really be unpacked.
Yeah. Thank you, Yuki. I'm really glad you brought the notion of the reverse migration, you know, to the discussion, because it's funny, because when my parents brought us in 1989 to New Zealand, and we didn't stay for a long time, but when we made the move, we thought we were coming permanently. But in 4 years' time, a little over 4 years, we returned. And so for me, you know, going back to Samoa in a matter of just over 4 years, the change that had happened in my absence in Samoa, I was very taken aback. And in fact, my image of Samoa actually was 4 years, you know, ago. And then having placed myself in Samoa 4 years later, seeing the difference, seeing how fast things had progressed, for me, I felt I didn't really belong. And it's part of my journey in that I was frustrated again, seeing that I wasn't fitting in. But I really do like the concept of the reverse migration, which you talk about. Recently, we were in PVG, which is the Pacific Postgraduate Talanoa group, and someone had actually presented on that reverse migration concept and her experience as well, and how there were disadvantages, yet there were some advantages of that as well. But yeah, thank you. I really do see your point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that as well. I mean, I haven't experienced that reverse migration back to Niue, but having conversations with my cousins who have gone back and now they're back in New Zealand, who went back to Niue, that our people are coming here telling us, oh, come back home, to help the economy and help build up Niue as a nation. But on the other hand, when people shift over, expecting that they will contribute to the economy, it seems like a lot of people are being blocked. And you highlighted that, Yuki, in your statement before. So the people that migrate back to Niue, they have very negative experiences. So they end up coming back here to New Zealand. So these are the things that we need to educate or inform our New Zealand-born Niue or Pacific people to be aware of these things. So when you go back to the islands, you're more able to adapt and try to overcome some of those barriers.
I think, thank you for that. I just wanted to add that I think part of the reason of this sort of negative experience for those of us that experience, you know, reverse migration, you know, and this kind of animosity or competition, or you know, the feeling of the people back home thinking that we're going to take over, is really comes down to capitalism. Because we're already in an island, we're already trying to, you know, scrape the scraps off the barrel for any resources that we have to become even more competitive as a developing country where there's less resources. So therefore, you know, there is this sense of threat for those of us, you know, that go back and thinking that, you know, we're millionaires. Yeah, so, you know, and I think that it's really all due to the capitalism, you know, that makes us try to sort of compete.
Yeah, that's such an apt comment, Yuki. Thank you for raising that up. Both the reverse migration and also capitalism in the post-colonial sort of setting as well, huh? I see Glenda here has raised her hand.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for a very good presentation. And I'm joining you from Canada in Alberta. My question, I'm interested more in what's kind of more prominent now from Western countries to island countries about the so-called retirement migration. It's kind of the same as reverse, but in a way that this kind of like in the West, they have this sort of snowbirds, you know. So I'm thinking, no, let's say it's kind of more of a summer bird, but permanently at the ebb of their life, like retirement migration, or kind of, I've heard many cases of people wanting to die back to their home country. So that, so what can you say about that context among the Pacific Islanders?
Thank you. Sorry, Ioane, Venusi, I'll jump in and then you can. The reason why I'm actually responding to your question, Glenda, is because I hadn't put it in my narrative. I hadn't mentioned it in my narrative, but that's exactly what my husband and I plan to do. When the time comes, we are planning to return home, because when we made the move to come to New Zealand, you know, we did so at a loss of many things, you know, and having to come here, restart, and it was always for the benefit of our children. But then, you know, we've also considered the fact that we weren't coming to stay permanently, because we intend to return to be in the home where we, you know, in the home country where we were born. And so that's always been on the agenda, and it will happen for us, you know, if God willing that we do reach the retirement ages that we want to. But it's because we want to make sure, I suppose it's, you know, it's the land that we belong, we see ourselves being part of, but also in the sense that we want to make sure that we are there to be the base for which our children and their children could actually return home and consider, you know, themselves as belonging, as citizens, as people of Samoa. And so for us, that's, you know, it's quite common, but my parents have also done the same thing. So they just 2 years ago, my father and mother returned back to Samoa. They've retired back home after being in New Zealand for, you know, for a couple of years. And that's because the heart yearns for it. And so it'll be different for different people. But I know also for a fact, you know, going back to what Yuki had mentioned in terms of how we're perceived as, you know, in a negative way, you know, I know of a story that popularized, or for the wrong reasons, put Samoa on the map in 1991, 92, where a family had retired back home, a couple had set up, and of course, being away from Samoa for a long time, weren't necessarily complying with village protocols. And as a result, you know, the man was killed. You know, there were repercussions for not following protocols. But again, there's different discussions depending on people's reasoning. But for us, when we made the move to come, we knew we were going to make the move back eventually.
Yeah, just adding on to that about the retirement migration back to the island. I think that concept is quite foreign, because you say retirement, but when you look at Niue, it's a very depopulated island. And then because it's very few people, it's not a retirement time for our people. You wear 5 to 6 hats. You can be a policeman, you can be a secretary and you're working for immigration. So I think, yeah, you'll never retire. Yeah, even though we say it's a retirement migration. And looking at Niue's population, there's quite a few people now starting to shift over and also contribute to the island itself. But yeah, sometimes people say, oh, look at them, they're coming back, they'll be of no use coming back here. We need more younger people. So what I'm saying here, that there is no retirement age. I think, I don't know if for other Pacific Islands, because when you go back, you're still going to work. You're going to work on the land, contribute to your village, and whatever spaces or church, or whatever spaces that you'll be part of.
Yeah, and I'll just add on one more point. My parents actually tried to retire back in Tonga, but what they found is that their family were tied back home. Their grandkids, they missed their grandkids. And Yuki mentioned capitalism. One aspect of retirement migration within the South Pacific is after 65, you get your pension in New Zealand. And if you do travel, you have to come back to New Zealand within 4 months, I think, for your pension to tick over again. Or 6 months, sorry. So I do know a lot of relatives, elderly relatives that go to Tonga, use their pension, come back and forth. But permanent retirement within my circle has been hard because elderly people miss their kids. Hello?
Yeah, so Glenda, a lot more complex than you thought, huh? Retiring to the sun. We will take one more question because we are really sort of, running out of time for this session, but we will be eating through our lunch, I think. Marion, and that will be our last question for this session, for this presentation.
Alofa lava, everyone. Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. As a Unitec alumni student and staff member, very proud. So talofa, everyone. Just wanted to build on the notion of the reverse migration. I think picked up as I did my ethnography in a Samoan village was I wrote about reverse ethnography, and so the idea of an outsider looking in. And I consider myself as a Samoan, show up, and then I'm seen as an outsider. So talk about, the makeover it was a makeover to make under, because I had blonde hair, dyed my hair blonde, and I rock up to the village, and, I speak Samoan, but then I was like, how can I connect with my people? And it wasn't about me fitting in with them. It was them realizing that, hey, I'm Samoan. There's the saying of that, you know you're Samoan by the way you stand, how you behave. And so I had to employ that so that they could see me as one of them, and then we could do the work together. So yeah, I think in terms of Yuki's comment about expanding that, and I think, the idea is how do we leverage and continue to build on the knowledge that we have, the knowledge, the wonderful stories. So it's a yes and then. So well done. Yeah. And yeah, I've been really enjoying, apologies for being late, but just with Yuki and her connections with colonization, neo-colonialism. I think I love that point about the ifonga and the MIQ, and I love how it's making me think. So I really hope, I'm looking forward to everyone's presentations. Hafte lava.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Daisy and Venusi and Io for such a rich personal narrative presentation that I think connected to all of us here today.